The title of my talk is Let's Get This Transition Moving. Okay, so outline briefly. So I have 4 suggestions, and I'll talk about each of these briefly. First of all, frame the discussion in terms of transition, fits with the title of my talk. Second, explore regional pathways. Third, develop green economic strategies. And fourth, consider carbon politics as well as carbon economics. Okay, so to start off with, I think we talk about climate change, we talk about all sorts of things, but I think it's helpful for the public policy discussion to frame this issue in terms of transition. So social scientists often talk about transitions. We have a transition to democracy. We have Eastern European countries that went through a transition after communism. There's literature on the transition from traditional fuels to fossil fuels and from coal to oil to natural gas and so on. The kinds of transition that I think we're interested here is what in the literature now they call socio-technical transitions, and the emphasis is on the socio as well as on the technical, which is the idea of large provisioning systems based on technologies through which we meet basic social needs. And we see these all around us, and a kind of classic example is something like sailing ships and steamships, where over a period of about 100 years, it took nearly that long, society went through a transition of maritime transport based on sail to ones based on steam. And looking at these transitions, we saw there were all sorts of interesting features. So for instance, in that particular historical case, the best sailing ships that were ever made were made in the period of intense competition with emerging steam vessels. For a long time, steam ships were inefficient, they cost more, and they were beaten hands down by sailing ships. But in the end, a transition took place. So what are some of the features of these socio-technical transitions? The first thing to say is that generally we see technologies are reasonably stable, and the emphasis is on incremental improvement within an existing paradigm. So think about the automobile. The basic plan for the automobile was kind of worked out between about 1890 and 1920. And that basic model, internal combustion engine, running on gasoline, 4 wheels, is with us today. But thousands of engineers working over years have gradually perfected it, decades of investment. Most technological progress takes place in that sort of frame. Occasionally there's a more radical change, and you can think about the earlier change from horse-drawn transport to the automobile itself, where the paradigm, the overall regime shifts. Regimes, niches, and landscape, these are just some of the ways that scholars look at the different forces, innovations coming up in the niches, the regimes, the dominant rules, the paradigm, the interlocked players from financing through to manufacturing and consumers that define a particular technological block, and the landscape being the broader context which influences how these things evolve. Wow, this really is tricky. Lock-in and path dependence. Most of you, or a lot of you anyway, are economists, so I don't need to go into these in any basic idea. But once a dominant design has emerged, technological effort focuses on perfecting that largely, and various, not just economic institutions, but political institutions, regulatory institutions, merge with and form to protect and to facilitate the operation of that dominant design. So upsetting it is difficult. It's not just coming up with a new technology, it's changing finance regimes, the way insurance companies model risk, and so on. Vision, hybrids, these are all sorts of things, typical things that you see in major socio-technical transitions. Visions help define, mobilize social resources, and if you look at the early history of the automobile, you find people pioneering these visions and trying to sell them to society and to governors. Hype, new technologies are almost always overhyped, and then there's a period of disappointment that sets in. But you need the hype, because otherwise you can't kind of dupe the investors in order to get the whole thing off the ground. Hybrid, in many areas, hybrid technologies serve the bridge. And interestingly, in the sailing ship example I just gave you, hybrids, boats with motors and sails, were a critical way in bridging this. And you can think about that today in the automotive context, where obviously hybrids are much discussed. Politics and policy. Most of these transitions, you can say they were driven by innovators, by inventors, but in all of them, politics and policy played a critical role. Why? Because you had to change the existing structures of regulation and governance in order to make the new technological innovations fit in. And in many of these innovations, if you think about something like the building of railroads, or you think about the internet, government played a critical role in opening the door. So for railroads, you had to expropriate the land which is kind of a basic thing, taking away people's land. Many of them, in all of them, building the highway network was already cited as an example. The state or government played a critical role in opening the door to the emergence of new technological regimes. And it should be said that incumbents of the old regimes do everything they can to deploy their lobbying power and their political influence to put brakes and kind of stick into the wheels of those who are trying to innovate. Just the automotive example I mentioned earlier, in between about 1880 and 1920, you see this fantastic innovation competition between steam-driven vehicles, electric vehicles, compressed air vehicles, 4 wheels, 6 wheels, 3 wheels, 2 wheels, until we got the basic design of the car that we know today, which then, since then, has been largely stable, though your car today does wonderful things that the Model T didn't. And interestingly, just in the last decade or so, it looks like that paradigm is beginning to open up again. That's to say, there is emerging competition of what the personal transport vehicles of the future will look like. So you've got competition between, you've got people who want to use gas, and you've got electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles and biofuel vehicles and hydrogen vehicles. And it's radically uncertain which of these is going to work, which is going to work in the coming decades, which is going to work beyond that period. That causes problems for those in the industries who want to innovate. It creates big problems for policymakers about how do we encourage innovation? Do we back one horse? Do we try to encourage the general field of innovation? And so on. And interestingly, it's very often external people, that's to say, in the automotive case, things like the fear of China or Tesla, people outside the industry, say in the electric vehicle thing, who are driving it or raising the threat of it, which encourages incumbents to develop their own options, in part as an insurance scheme. So, the advantages of framing, I've just talked briefly about socio-technical transitions. Why should we try and frame the present discussion in these terms? Well, here are some of the reasons why I think we need to talk about a transition to a low carbon emission energy sector, and to portray it in those sorts of terms. So this is a long-term thing. It's not something that a government bill is going to solve, or one round of spending is going to solve. We're looking at decades ahead of moving our energy system off one path and onto another. And the idea of transition suggests this movement over time, but it also suggests a clear directionality. We know that in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, we can argue about the time frame. Fossil fuels emissions have to be driven to virtually zero in the energy sector in all the developed countries, and the developing countries too, but in the first instance, we're talking about countries like Canada. And I'm just, by building a kind of, if you like, framing the public discussion in this way, it helps us understand, it helps Private investors make decisions thinking about, well, we're in this transition, so we're headed. It imparts a directionality. And it also allows you to kind of engage with phrases that you hear a lot. So I've got one there. Fossil fuels will continue to meet the bulk of our energy needs for many decades to come, which is almost an entry ticket into serious discussions of energy policy on the international level. You've got to say that first. You can say anything you want about a green future, but you kind of say that first. Well, yes, it's true, but it won't be that way in all countries, and how soon we will move beyond fossil fuels is up for grabs. And the important thing is to see that we need a transition away from carbon-emitting fossil fuels. I'll skip the other point and go on. So for policy, it can help coordinate social actors, links to other strategic approaches like carbon budgeting, encourage innovation, and there are a few other little things down there which I'll let you look at. Okay, so my first point then is, let's frame this discussion in terms of a transition to a low carbon economy. Then we'll discuss how do we get there and at what pace. And at the bottom, a few suggestions of orientation for research. My second point is, let's explore regional pathways to a low carbon economy. In Canada, originally the debate was kind of largely focused about a national policy, then nothing happened, so people turned attention to BC's carbon tax and regional things as a kind of second or third best thing. What I would like to argue is, in the context of Canada, regional transition pathways is not a second best thing. It's a critical element if we're going to make progress on this. So the fact is, Canada has a fragmented energy political economies. Different regions, provinces have followed different historic trajectories. Quebec's historical development trajectory since 1900 with its hydro resource, what they've done with it, how it's been politically constructed as a Quebecois achievement building out this hydroelectricity system, is just different than Alberta's energy system with its hydrocarbon resources. And that again is different from Ontario with its nuclear generation capacity, its, in recent history, lack of fossil fuels and things like that. The industrial linkages and indeed the political life of those regions is heavily influenced by their foundation energy resources. We have to take that into account. Now, I don't want to go too far. Of course, I agree there are unifying things. There's federal jurisdiction over things. The Canadian banks are involved in energy plays from coast to coast. Big energy firms invest in multiple provinces. And yes, many of the technologies for the low carbon economy will actually be on the international market. And if Canada wants to be players, our firms have to be players on those international markets as well. All that is true, but it doesn't change the fact that the regional element is critical in Canadian political economy. So, if we're going to seriously talk about a transition to a low-carbon economy, in the first instance, then we have to start from the existing political economy, the comparative advantages of these regions, and the opportunities that may be there. So, Quebec versus Alberta, I think, is kind of pretty evident. Quebec is talking about pushing electric vehicles. Alberta has its fossil infrastructure. Are there opportunities there as well? So, defining these sorts of regional pathways, I've just put down a bunch of points. First, understand what the historical development trajectory of the energy resources and the way they're linked to the regional economy. Identify firms and clusters with potential to propel decarbonization. Identify resources and promising technologies. Build visions that draw on local traditions and potential. And again, that will be different in Quebec than it will be in Ontario or Alberta. Exploit local government institutions and identify complementarities, obviously, with neighboring jurisdictions. For instance, Manitoba's hydro might help Saskatchewan or things like that, and nationally. So my plea is, don't get me wrong, it's not against the national framework, and obviously something like carbon pricing would be great, but it's to build, if you like, a local regional development block in favor of a transition to a low carbon economy. So that feeds into my third point then, which is green economic strategies. So traditional industrial strategies have fallen from grace. In a room full of economists, I don't think I need to explain why that is. Traditional industrial policies were largely based very much on protection of local industries until they can get strong enough to compete on international markets. That said, in practice, governments routinely intervene, not necessarily with an industrial strategy, but all over the board subsidizing this, giving tax breaks to that, trying to attract companies in order to make jobs and so on. So I think obviously there's a contrast between old industrial policy and new green economic strategies, which you can, in a lot of work, say, of UNEP or the World Bank on the green economy, you can see whole rafts of policy suggestions and so on. But the basic line comes down to this: carbon pricing is important, it's critical, but it just isn't enough, because there are other, in economic language, I would suggest you would say market failures or externalities, other than just CO2 and its effect on the environment, which need to be dealt with in order to accelerate the uptake of new technologies and the development of those technologies. 2 words on the picking winners argument. Often it's said, well, government's no good at picking winners, so that's a reason why we mustn't pump money into R&D or other forms of subsidies. Well, it's true. Governments aren't particularly good at picking firms or even sectors that are going to win in international competition. But then again, no one else is that good either. And businesses are littered with firms that made the wrong choice. Of course, they go bust or get absorbed by someone else, whereas the government's still there years later for you to complain, remember when they did that stupid thing. There are frameworks where where government can support green innovation and be relatively technologically neutral, and that may be great. Ultimately, who cares where the motive power for the vehicles comes from in the future, as long as it doesn't cause environmental harm and it's reasonably priced and so on. But there's many areas in energy policy where government actually just has to pick, because if they don't pick, nothing's going to happen. So think about if we want new nuclear power plants in Ontario, and I'm not saying we do, but if one did, nothing's going to be built unless the state assumes the unlimited indemnity for accidents. And the same goes for CCS in terms of the long-term stewardship of carbon underground. So the areas where public policy actually has to decide, do we go down this route or do we not go down this route? So start by considering, to actually develop these strategies, start by considering whether we can exploit existing resources, infrastructure, technological capacity, and expertise to leverage into greener areas. So these are some of the questions that one can ask in order to do that. And there are kind of some research questions that relate to the idea of what would a green economic strategy look like? What lessons can we learn from successes and failures in the past? Okay, last point that I want to make, consider low carbon politics as well as economics. So most people, I think, in the room would agree that the primary obstacles are not technological or economic, at least economic in the sense that we mean the economy would be brought to its knees by moving off carbon-emitting fossil fuels. So that means we need to think politically, and I think other people on the panel will raise some of the dimensions which that can mean, but I'm going to just mention a few quickly. So explicitly think about building political coalitions, political and economic coalitions. So that means the green business sector. Strengthen the green business sector. The more jobs, the more money, the more influence that it will have politically. And the idea is you get into a benign cycle. Yes, there are problems with rent seeking and things like that, but That exists throughout the whole economy. That's just the way policy and politics work. Governance institutions, they're things that can actually make a difference. So I've mentioned just one, the creation of national carbon budgets in the United Kingdom and the Climate Change Committee, which gives independent assessment of these 5-year rolling climate budgets. That's an institutional innovation that helps bring climate change more in the public eye. Burden sharing. Canada has been unable to engage with this. Critical in the original introduction of the first emissions trading scheme within the European Union was the idea of burden sharing. Some states went ahead, like Germany. Other states, like Spain, got a pass. They were less economically developed. The requirements for emissions control were deferred in time for them. If you can't discuss distributional issues, it's going to be very hard to have a policy framework. Almost done. So, efficiency isn't everything. This is a room of economists. Of course, you love efficiency, and I like efficiency too, but policy doesn't usually work that way. Of course, I want to save money too, but look, you know, the policy for prisons and penal reform isn't efficient. The policy on old age isn't efficient. Military procurement isn't efficient. There isn't an area of policy that you can say we're anywhere near the optimum. So let's not get obsessed with optimum low carbon policies, because they ain't going to happen that way. Let's focus, I agree, make them as optimum as possible, but realize that it's going to be a long way from that. 2 points only to remain. Delegitimizing opponents. Technological transitions involve brutal struggles where some technologies, regions, workforce get crushed and others emerge. And of course, I want to have retraining for workers and all sorts of things. But one of the key measures in those battles is delegitimizing opponents. That's to say, dirty technologies, we don't want them anymore. Oh, you work for that company? Ugh, I'd look for another job if I were you. Okay, that's a caricature. But this struggle over time is going to involve that. And my last point is weakening the structural power of incumbents, which links to the delegitimizing. The fossil fuel industries enjoy incredible strength internationally, particularly in a country like Canada. Politically, one has to think about weakening their structural power. There are all sorts of ways to do this. Removing subsidies on fossil fuels is one way that can do it. Doing protests against pipelines, even though it won't change the world of fossil fuels, sure creates a lot of headaches for the emitting fossil industry and makes them think about carbon abatement. But the other way is to tack oil demand on the longer term rather than just oil supply. So I would argue that politically, any support, investment, encouragement that states make for electric vehicles, from encouraging entrepreneurs to getting together to funding research and so on, potentially weakens the fossil sector. And rather than saying, oh, transport is the most difficult, let's leave that to last, because we have other options in electricity and so on. Flip it around, say transport's the most difficult? That's a place that we should start now exploring options to liquid fossil fuels. Thank you.